Okay, so thank you for being here and to join us in this panel. And welcome to this panel on industrial policy meets competition. It's my pleasure to moderate this session. The debate now, and this debate revolves around a topic that it's not only timely, but increasingly central to economic policy making, the evolving interplay between industrial policy and competition policy. The tone was already set by Philippe Aguillon's interview, and we do note that both the Draghi and Letta reports put forward the diagnosis representing a significant added value. The European Commission also set the tone for action, claiming, among others, the need to close the innovation gap and to fully explore the benefits offered by our vast single market. And as Mr. Draghi has pointed out, Europe needs regulation and a market environment that is startup-friendly. The focus has been on the barriers in the EU that may hamper innovation efforts, entry by startups, as well as their expansion. And as Professor Philippe Aguillon has rightly pointed out, anything that we can do towards a more integrated market will boost innovation, adding that Europe needs to move from imitation-based growth to innovation-based growth. At the same time, as industrial ambitions grow there have been claims supporting national champions, and this raises crucial questions. Is championing one or two firms, if we champion one or two firms, do we leave room for the startups and the disruptors? Wouldn't this stifle the very innovation and investment that industrial policy aims to encourage? Therefore, competition policy nowadays has been in the spotlight. Competition can contribute to industrial policy objectives, ensuring that its core mission of maintaining fair and open market is not compromised. As competition authorities, our goal is to ensure that firms compete on the merit, not privilege. And there are just a few aspects we aim to cover in our discussion following Professor Philippe Aguillon's interview. So I'm honored to introduce a distinguished and remarkable group of speakers and friends, may I say, to share with us their views and experience. So on my left, we have, of course, Cani Fernandes. She's well known, but even though I have to say a few words about Cani, she's a very good friend, not only of the Portuguese authority, but of Portugal. She's the chair of the Comisión Nacional de Mercados de Competencia in Spain, and has been recognized year after year as one of the 30 best specialists in competition and antitrust worldwide, as well as one of the 100 women in antitrust worldwide, both in 2018 and 2019. I do my research, Cani. So, Cani, gracias por estar acá. Lisboa. Also, we have, after Cani, Benoît Couret. Benoît is the president of the l'Autorité de la Concurrence in France, and at the same time, he's chair of the OECD Competition Committee. So we have two hats to perform in your position, both at the OECD and in France. Benoît has a deep knowledge in financial markets. Previously, he was member of the executive board and of the governing council of the European Central Bank. And afterwards, he served as the head of the innovations division of the Bank of International Settlements. And also, we have, last but not the least, of course, Antonio Andreoni. He is a professor of development economics at the Department of Economics of the SOAS University of London and co-founding director of the SOAS Center for Sustainable Structural Transformation. Antonio is a renowned economist with specialization, among others, in industrial policy. He has published extensively, and he has over 15 years of experience as advisor at international organizations such as the UNCTAD, the World Bank, or the OECD. He's also been advising several national governments, including Portugal at the moment. Maybe you can speak a bit about your Portuguese experience as advisor to different Portuguese governments. As this panel demonstrated, I greatly value opportunities for cross-policy dialogue, and this is an opportunity to have this cross-policy dialogue. In fact, I think that we need to infuse competition into other public policies, ensuring an integrated approach to the work that we've been doing. And as agencies, I do think we need to reach out to other policy stakeholders and materialize this interaction in what I've been calling as nowadays competition 2.0 or I would say a new legal ecosystem of competition that we've been faced with nowadays. So just to make a roadmap of this panel, in the first part of the session, we'll take a closer look at the framework of the industrial policy debate and the role of competition. In the second part, we'll focus on showcasing EU and national experiences and strategies fostering competitiveness, driving innovation to the benefit of consumers and the economy as a whole. And then, finally, we'll touch upon the role of international cooperation, particularly the contributions that international forums, such as the OECD, the ICN, and others, namely at the regional level, can provide to this debate. So I will start with Antonio. Once again, thank you so much for coming to Portugal. I know you're a frequent flyer to Lisbon, actually. So Antonio, in this context, can you take us through the new theory of industrial policy and the role of competition in that context?
Thanks so much. Thanks for this opportunity. It's a great pleasure to be here. And in a way, I would like to use a few minutes to actually try to go through how we got to this conversation now, why industrial policy is so much a part of the political discussion. It's not been always the case. And all the time, industrial policy re-emerge in discussions, we say industrial policy is back. But in fact, industrial policy is always there and always been there in the history of capitalism and transformation of the major economies around the world. And in a way, setting the story right is also a way to start unpacking this relationship between industrial and competition policy and how it's been managed, governed by different countries' experiences over the years. Now, if we look at the recent past, in a way, what we are observing today, it's actually the result of several crises that have led to actually an open discussion around what industrial policy can do to address this crisis. If we start with the financial crisis, I was in the UK, in the conversation with the UK government, there was a big concern about rebalancing the economy and the extent to which that economy, highly deindustrialized, was, and to a certain extent also highly financialized, was unable to address some of the problems that the Draghi report later pointed out, commercialization of innovation, and so on and so forth. So the story is quite old in a way. The other important turn was, of course, the Paris Agreement and the realization that actually we need to take seriously not just in terms of carbon adjustment mechanism and so on, but we needed to mainstream some approach around green industrial policy. And the European Union has been quite incrementally quite a lead in some of these areas, at least from the point of view of policy formulation. The Green Deal and later some of the initiative around that. It's been a lead, but also quite a slow lead in the sense that for quite a significant amount of time, in practice, the interventions were pretty much based on market-based solutions more than industrial policy with directionality and specific type of intervention. It's interesting how while all this discussion, if you think about the Green Deal, was coming through the fore, the pandemic came in and boosted the confidence that actually government could play a very important role in addressing immediate need for change, for transition, introducing dynamism where was required. And so interventions in terms of streamlining some value chain, supply chain that were required to address the pandemic. And finally, we get to the geopolitical turn, which again was building up as a result of the way in which the different countries, the leading countries, were engaging with these different crises and their approaches to industrial policy. And we get to this conversation where often people are now talking about industrial policy in the US or in Europe, but we are using the same word to talk about very different things. We are talking about very traditional mercantilist measures that have been recently deployed, in fact, already in the previous Trump administration and to a certain extent continued under Biden. And we talk about measures like the one that China has been deploying over the last 20 years. Now, what is interesting when you think about these experiences is that competition has been understood in the industrial policy discussion in very different ways. Professor Aguillon already hinted to the fact that China actually used competition, doesn't have this idea that industrial policy is simply about constraining competition. Actually, it's the idea that industrial policy fundamentally creates context for competition. Use competition to steer processes of transformation that the market, especially when market don't exist, would not be able to deliver. And interestingly enough, China, many of the major players that today are leading in wind technology, in robotics, in lots of Huawei, if we think about companies in the digital space and so on, they didn't came out from simple state aid. Actually, they came out from complex processes through which there was selection of different players and mix of different instruments, which were both providing state aid, but also creating markets and context to actually translate that into competitive outcome. This idea is actually borrowed by all the experience of East Asia. Joseph Stiglitz, another Nobel Prize winner who, after the Nobel Prize has an effect on economists. They tend to become more open about what they really think sometimes. Famously, in his interpretation of the East Asian miracle, said that the most important ingredient there was how Korea, Taiwan, these countries were using competition as part of their industrial policy, and effectively how they thought about competition policy as an industrial policy measure, so how they were using principle of industrial policy to inform competition policy. Now, come to Europe, the story is very different to a certain extent. I think Professor Aguillon already set the tone of the long-term kind of bias that existed, that has been dominating the debate, not just at the level of the Commission, but also at the level of the authorities. I think what is problematic there is not simply that the competition policy has been understood as antithetic to industrial policy, but also that we have been very slow in realizing what are the deep implications of this. And I think the Draghi and Letta report, from two different perspectives, fundamentally are with some problems there, but they are fundamentally pointing to this inconsistency. If you think, going back to the Lisbon agenda, the famous knowledge economy and so on, and this idea that we were moving towards this kind of new venture for Europe future, actually has pointed out how without an industrial manufacturing base that is distributed, that is competitive, where value chain are able to create value and distribute value along the value chain so that players can be able to reinvest and drive growth, drive innovation, without that it's not possible to operate. The pandemic showed that Europe actually was very innovative. There was no such a thing as the Pfizer vaccine. It was BioNTech vaccine, which was scaled up by an American player for specific condition related to the pharma market in the US. Now, the recent realization that the Lisbon agenda type of approach, horizontal measure, where fundamentally the European Union support horizontal measure across, and then individual states do their own vertical measures, it's actually very problematic because it reinforces dynamics of not convergence by divergence. If you look at NASTRIN level data around what happened across Europe over the last 20 years, is basically deindustrialization and concentration in specific areas. Of course, some of that is led to a change in the competitive space internationally, but it's also about how we managed the transition to a number of industries, technologies, and restructuring of value chain across Europe. Now, the Draghi report idea that fundamentally we need investment, of course, it's central, it's critical. Problem related to markets, structures, coordination, and so on. It's to a certain extent problematic when we make of the US example a model of convergence, because in a way, the analysis around what the US is capable to deliver needs to be understood in the context of the kind of businesses and the kind of value that is created or projected in the US. The US is a highly financialized economy where when Biden introduced the IRA to support investment, it's not that these companies didn't have cash to make investment. They were floating in cash that they didn't know what to make of. In fact, some of the major advisors to the US government at the time, they were saying, well, there is a problem, there is too much cash around, but there are no good market opportunities or business investment opportunity. This is 2019. If you think about it, it's so paradoxical, right? Given what has happened after. Now, in the case of Europe, when we think about the kind of structure of the economy and we think about the commitment toward the green transition, I think lots has been said around the importance of engaging with digital markets, the power of digital markets. I think Lina Khan has been a very important player in also changing the practices of engagement on the different type of abuse of power and so on and so forth of these, and more fundamentally, the market shaping power of these platforms. I think areas where we have been less, we have paid less attention, or we are starting paying more attention, are really about the way in which the restructuring of the economy we are seeing now. It's not a simple change in parameters of efficiency or size of firm. It's a fundamentally rethinking of the technological paradigm that underpin many sectors. When we think about the way in which, again, countries who are now competitive like China have managed their competitiveness, they've deliberately created enormous competition upstream so that price downstream would allow players to be able to deliver in their innovation, in their diversification and so on. In Europe, we have upstream industries who are fundamentally on their knees, right? If we think about the steel industry, chemicals and so on, these are key industries that at the moment, given the energy prices and given the need to basically rethink how they produce key raw industrial materials in the global competitive space, are asking for different type of interventions. And of course, the temptation would be simply state support, right? Just supporting the individual national champions. But this doesn't necessarily is going to deliver competitive outcomes. So the problem is how you think about how to complement industrial and competition policy to accompany processes of transformation. Let me close with an example, a very concrete example, that also allows to realize that this is not simply coordination in a static sense, it's very dynamic. If we think about the wind sector, for example, right? We know that we are not going to manage to drive the green transition without having massive deployment of energy technologies. And we are not blessed with amount of land like in Africa or in other countries where you can put lots of solar panels around, right? Now, wind technologies are critical. And in fact, Europe had a technology edge in wind technology in the early stages of the advancement of that. How that was built? But fundamentally feed-in tariff systems, right? Now, at some point, we have feed-in tariff allows fundamentally to guarantee a certain amount of demand over a certain long period, and lots of companies like Siemens, then Siemens Gamesa and others, were benefiting a lot from a specific type of arrangement. We thought that the industry was mature and was ready to move towards more, of course, competitive practices, auction-based type of demand creation mechanism. And suddenly, many of these companies have gone, not bust, but they are losing a significant amount of money, in the order of hundreds of millions. And some of them are losing market share, even within Europe. Now, in that kind of transition, the issue is how you use industrial policy and how you introduce competitive pressure so that these companies are able to remain competitive internationally. And I think understanding what is the timing of sequencing interventions, maintaining competition while understanding the technological dynamics in these sectors and how these companies have time or not to restructure to catch with these technologies is an example of the kind of concrete challenges that at the industrial organization level we are facing in Europe. So ultimately, just to conclude on this first set of remarks, we've been, and Professor Aguillon stressed, the way in which we are still stuck in a sort of static efficiency type of way of thinking. I think the narrative has moved towards some more dynamic efficiency, dynamic rivalry kind of conversation, but how we translate that in ways, in tools that allows authorities to actually be able to make decisions, I think we are still in the middle of that conversation, and learning from the experience of countries who have been more open about their industrial policy, the mention about DARPA, ARPA-E and so on, it's very similar to what actually we have seen happening in China later on. I think it's an important wake-up call for Europe, and not simply in the space which would be the easy temptation of military rearmaments and things like that, but actually in those key sectors that have made Europe a social market model that has delivered, up to a certain point, going back to the letter report, some level of integration, some level of social progress that we need to put at the center of this innovation agenda.
Very interesting. Thank you, Antonio, for setting the tone to this panel. And you mentioned the role of the competition agency. So now moving to you, Kenny, what's your take on the interplay between competition policy and industrial policy, and what do you think should be the role of the competition agencies in order to support industrial policy objectives?
Thank you very much, Nuno. Thank you to the ADC, and it is a pleasure being here. I hope to listen and think a lot, and also hope to contribute to the debate. It's always a very good moment to stop and reflect the Lisbon conference. So thank you very much. So yeah, we know that we are in a context in which, if we wonder just a bit which are the specific traits that we are living, we immediately detect that we are facing important challenges in Europe. We are, everybody's talking about the digital transition, the green transition as well. We are subject now to geopolitical difficulties as well and problems. And in this context, priorities seem to have changed. And this has a lot to do with the new industrial policy that we have to overcome, and how from competition point of view, we can help it. And now we think that, for example, the new priorities are strengthening our industrial base. We talk a lot about boosting competitiveness and also ensuring resilience. So that is the reason why I believe there is this re-emergence of industrial policy worldwide, although I fully agree with Antonio that industrial policy has always been there. We tend to believe that industrial policy is about targeting state intervention or government intervention, such as subsidies, or trying to support strategic sectors into the economy, specific sectors that are considered to be strategic, whereas competition policy has to do more with open up markets that may remain competitive, so that anyone can, with a good idea, is able to deliver in that fair markets. So in this respect, they are seen as inherently contrarian. I believe that's not the case. Today, what we are seeing is that we have this criticism, this gap in the European productivity towards China and the United States, this criticism of lack of a scale, and then there is this pointing at the competition authorities as being the culprits of this lack of a scale. We will see, and I think Benoit is going to address that in his intervention, that fragmentation or lack of capital markets or others are probably more direct explaining elements that the competition authorities in itself. It's not only that they are asking us to help companies to gain a scale, it's also that they are asking us to embrace other objectives like sustainability or social elements or others. And things have been presented in a way that are confronted, like if we were completely incompatible. My view, on the contrary, is that those are complementary policies. Industrial policy can be helped by competition policy, and competition policy has to be embedded in the industrial policy. And, for example, in order to be globally competitive, you have to exercise that muscle at home. That was something that, for example, Margaret Vestager used to say, and I do believe that this is the case. So I think that when you have well-designed industrial policies that can have a look of long-term competitiveness, they can go hand in hand with competition policy. And I would like to illustrate this with an example that is very well described and analyzed in a paper that was written by 3 recent Nobel Prize laureates, and the most recent one is Philippe Aghion, together with Matthias de Watripont and with Jean Tirole. And they emphasized the same idea that competition policy and industrial policy can go hand in hand and find very good outcomes. The paper was published in 2024, and it has to do with the mRNA vaccine, so during the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and they they expose in the paper a very good example of competition-friendly industrial policy. So, as you may remember, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, the BARDA, concentrating its funding on 3 technologies, with 2 projects in each technology, one being from the US, another one being European. And all 6 indeed are being approved by the US Food and Drug Administration and the European Medicines Authority in record time. Interestingly, the 2 main winners, the US firm Moderna and the German firm BioNTech, were small biotechs, and only one project originated, one of the 6 projects originated from one pre-pandemic global leader in vaccines, a Sanofi-GlaxoSmithKline partnership. And I think this is a very good example to illustrate what could be a template of successful European industrial policy. More elements for the discussion, for example, competition policy has been illustrated not to be an obstacle in industrial policy for firms to be competitive. Furthermore, and this is well illustrated in the crisis that we've been experiencing lately, there is also economic literature that supports the idea that in times of crisis, the Keynesian multiplier is much more effective when you have expansive fiscal policy. If companies are competitive in a well-functioning market, this Keynesian multiplier is much higher. And this is also an example that illustrates how one policy can interact with another one. So that's to sum up the idea for me. We have to find the way in which to complement each other. There are many, many ways in doing so. Competition authorities may use our prioritization potentials in order to select those sectors of the economy that have a multiplier factor into the economy. Let's take, for example, the example of credit markets. If we focus our attention in order to provide for a more competitive credit market, probably this will have a global effect into the economy. Also, take sectors that represent a good input into many outputs of the economy. The Bank of Spain has, for example, these tables illustrating which sectors of the economy are essential inputs into the economy as a whole. So if we prioritize our focus on those sectors, that will have a multiplier factor into the economy. And also in our advocacy function, we can advise governments how to always have the element of competition in the design of their policies. So all in all, I think that we can cooperate a lot in order to provide a better outcome, remaining at the basis of our principles. And I will leave it here because I think in the second row we can illustrate it with more concrete examples. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Kani. You already mentioned the role that we have as a competition agencies in order to promote industrial policy hand in hand with competition policy, and it's good. The diagnosis was made by Professor Philippe Aguillon. We need to move from an imitation-based growth to an innovation-based growth. So now moving to you, Benoit, what's your view about the interplay between competition policy and industrial policy? And secondly, how can we boost innovation in the internal market nowadays?
Yeah. So good morning, everyone, and thank you, Nuno, and also to all ADC colleagues for putting together this conference, which is really brilliant and very useful. And also thank you for inviting Philippe Aguillon to set the stage. And there are, for many reasons. I mean, first, it's always so good to see Philippe's energy and unabating energy on screen, which kind of gives us an image of what the European innovation scene should look like. Full of energy and movement, and also because Philippe's and also his co-authors' thinking, I think, perfectly set the stage for our discussion, as many of us have already mentioned. Philippe has really achieved a tour de force, which is to reconcile Joseph Schumpeter and Kenneth Arrow. We learned at school that Schumpeter thought that in order to innovate, you need size and you need profits, because there are fixed costs to be paid and invested, and also because you need to be able to reap the benefits of your innovation if you want to be incentivized to innovate. And that's what the Apples and Metas and the French and German CEOs of this world are telling us every day. You know, we want to be big if we want to innovate. While talking about French and German CEOs, they are now telling us that they haven't read the letter they signed. So I'm not sure whether it's good news or bad news, but that's another discussion. Okay. And then Arrow came saying, yeah, but if you let the economy being dominated by incumbents, then of course they don't want to be disrupted, and then they have no incentives to innovate. And it's always a kind of balancing act between the two. And what Philippe and his co-authors have achieved is to reconcile the two visions. So it's not a kind of a traditional on the one hand, on the other hand, kind of economist kind of a little bit hypocritical balancing act. It's just that we need both. We need both. Yeah. We need some amount of profits to incentivize innovation, but not too much. Otherwise, innovation is being disincentivized. And also, Philippe has been very, very aware of and mindful of the social consequences of all that, and of the need for strong social policies also to help the losers and to make for the negative consequences of creative destruction, and that's an important part of the discussion, I think. Okay, so and then Enrico Letta and Mario Draghi came, yeah. And what they've added to the discussion, in my view, is really first the European dimension and the importance of the single market, and the fact that fragmentation in the single market is one of the biggest hurdles we have today to innovate and to scale up. And also the importance of funding and capital markets and an adequate structure of capital markets to fund innovation, which we have much less in Europe than in the US, right? And I think the first message is really extremely important, that if we want to, so I think we will all agree this morning that we need, that industrial policy and competition are complements and rather than substitutes, and that we need ways to combine the two. But then we need to act, and we need to find practical ways to do it. And both Letta and Draghi, I think, shows us a direction, which is that if we want to make industrial policy more, pro-competitive, it has to be done at the European level and not at the national level. In a way, it cannot be done at the national level because national markets are just too small. And if you want to do the kind of things that Candy explained, having a pro-competitive investment in vaccines, for instance, that has to be at the European level. It cannot be at a national level. So we need to move toward this, and this leads to very practical recommendations. Like, we have this, I think, good European tool called IPCEI. State aid being cleared for big innovative projects. Fine. There should be a condition that there should be a strict condition that IPCEIs have to be pan-Europeans. I think that should be more kind of enshrined in the conditionality. There also has to be an understanding and an acceptance that industrial policy at the European level has to involve a geographic dimension. So take a question like, take data centers. We all want more data centers, fine, and supercomputers. What's the best place to have data centers? If we would have that discussion at the European level, maybe we would find out that the best place to have data centers is Slovenia, or maybe it's Malta, or maybe it's Lithuania. I just don't know. But it doesn't have to be France or Germany, right? And today we see member states competing and queuing in the corridors of DG Comp to get the state aid approval for projects in their countries.
We have that in Portugal.
And Portugal, I know. They're all doing that, but that's suboptimal because we would need to take that kind of approach at the European level and to have a more kind of forceful and organized discussion on the geography of industrial policy at a European level. And I could speak a lot about capital markets, but I'm not going to do that. Maybe one dimension which I think, I believe, might have been more emphasized in both the Draghi and the Letta reports is about the governance of industrial policy. the governance of industrial policy has to be pro-competitive. So you need to put a lot of emphasis and efforts on, independent juries, merit-based selection of industrial projects and all that. That's embedded in some industrial policies, not all of them. So governance is very important, and that kind of takes us back to one other Nobel Prize, by the way, last year's Nobel Prize, because we had 2 Nobel Prizes in a row about, talking about innovation and growth. And last year was Acemoglu and Daron Acemoglu and Simon Johnson and James Robinson. And what Acemoglu and Simon Johnson in their latest works have really emphasized is about the governance and the politics of industrial policy, and the fact that if innovation is being hindered in many places in the world, it's not only because of private sector incumbents, it's also because of politicians holding back and politicians having no incentive to be, they also don't want to be disrupted in a way. So what applies to big private sector incumbents also applies to politicians. They don't want to be disrupted, and so they don't always have the right incentives to put in place the right innovation policies. So I'm pretty sure that in Daron's and Simon's view, that applied first and foremost to low-income and developing economies, but just take that framework and apply it to Europe and let that sink in. I think we should be more mindful of the importance of having the right governance, and we as competition authorities, we can have a say on that. So maybe one last word is about the whole conversation on industrial policy and competition. It's a good discussion. We're having it in many conferences. It's getting better conference after conference, so it's better here than it was in the last conference because we are learning. So there is a learning by doing, effect, just like in economic theory, but it remains quite abstract. It remains high level, and so I think now time has come to walk the talk and to make it practical. And we need a framework that is legally and economically sound and robust, beyond all these nice words that we're having on stage. And that's really what the essence of the discussion on the new merger guidelines will be about. Taking all these good ideas and enshrining them into a framework that is legally robust. And it's easier said than done. There are lots of promises about investment and innovation that will not necessarily materialize. We had a former president in France, Jacques Chirac, who used to say, promises only bind those who believe them, right? And that somehow applies to merger commitments as well, right? Merger remedies. So we need the right framework to make sure that all these innovation defenses, investment defenses, maybe resilience defenses, security defenses, you name it, that are going to come to us to make sure that they are legally and economically robust, and today we don't have that. And I think it's on the Commission's shoulders, so we trust the Commission to deliver this framework. I'm looking at Lindsay, because it's hard work, and it's going to be fast, and you don't have much time to do that, but it's very important that now we put that particularly into the merger guidelines, and also that we get more specific about some concepts that are being used in that discussion, like resilience. So politicians and CEOs come and tell us, we want you to clear mergers that are good for resilience. I mean, at that stage, it sounds good. Why not? But when you think about the contribution of competition to resilience, it plays in different ways. I mean, you don't want to face a monopoly supplier, right? So diversity and competition and having a number of different suppliers, that's good for resilience, actually. Resilience is not about having one single supplier in each member state. So let's think it through and put some more flesh on all these concepts, which sound nice, but are not necessarily workable. I stop here.
Good, Benoit. I think at the end, EU is very good in planning, but not in executing. That's one of the problems. The diagnosis is made, but the problem comes with the curve at the end. So moving to Kenny. Kenny mentioned the role of the competition agencies in order to help industrial policy. Can you give us some concrete examples that you've done at the CNMC in order to implement some of the industrial policy objectives in your agency?
Thank you, Nuno. Yes, I can provide you with some examples from the, both from the enforcement point of view and also from the advocacy point of view, which seems rather more logical. But also from the enforcement point of view, I think that with our priority setting, we can contribute a lot. And for example, a discussion on sustainability that we've been having for the last years in Europe can be approached from many angles. One of the angles that we decided to approach it from in Spain was that, for example, we realized that waste management and waste recycling was in the hands of a monopoly. So we decided to focus our enforcement priorities in considering the way to open up that monopoly. And so we ended up having a fast-track procedure that ended up with commitments, with undertakings by the monopoly company in order to open up the market immediately. Instead of trying to enforce that until the very last sanction and fine and going to court and then 10 years, and we believe that at that moment, negotiating undertakings to open up it and put in place a bid process that would allow other companies to enter the market was a much more efficient solution. And in that, I think, when we observed the problems that the market was facing in that particular area, we decided also to undertake a study on the waste management and the recycling in Spain, and that we did it through the advocacy department, which is another thing that I would like to underline. I mean, the synergies between, in the industrial policy discussion, the synergies between enforcement and advocacy, because you can help each other by detecting in, for example, advocacy, which are the problems of a particular market, and then using enforcement, or through enforcement seeing that you have a limit, you cannot go further because there is a protection given by law, for example, and therefore by recommending the legislator to change it if you are facing these barriers that you cannot overcome through advocacy. We also are favoring markets in which, for example, in the energy, digital, or logistics, that we see this multiplying factor, and by doing so, we see that the multiplier is there. So we have limited resources, but if you can act on a specific sector like this, energy, of course, we know all of us that's one of the problems that we are facing. We have the potential of having lots of energy that's with prices tending to zero, because renewable energy is that. I mean, the resources that we are having, the basis is zero price. So the potential is there, but if we find that there are obstacles to that at the national level, we are dealing it with competition and on our regulatory side. At the European level, I always take the opportunity to remind that the interconnection that we are having with the rest of the European market is not working, and that someone should help us, because we have the potential of having the cheapest energy prices in the world that are renewable. And with the strengths that we have in backing with security, for example, from the nuclear power plants in France, with the renewables in the south of Europe, with the possibility of batteries everywhere in the north, and we are really, we have the potential of being probably the best place to have renewable energy tending to zero price. So that I put it there for the capitals to react to this, because I don't think it is a problem of the competition authorities, but those that have to push for the interconnection are the capitals, with a little help of my friends of the European Commission. So I leave it there. I will go to advocacy now. What we are doing, trying to help industrial policy, is focusing on those sectors of the economy that will have more impact. We've realized that public intervention has to be done on the basis of competition principles, because, as I was saying, if they go hand in hand, aligning with the objectives long-term, then everybody wins. And one of the examples that I can put forward is that in 2021, in the midst of the sanitary crisis going to the economic crisis, we reflected on the competition authority how we could help to get out from the crisis. And we published the recommendations to public authorities for pro-competitive market intervention, because that was a moment in which to get out from the crisis, intervention was needed. So we were fearing that that intervention would be done applying competition principles. So we published what we call the 3 decalogues, so principles that should help intervention in a more competitive way in the market, decalogue for efficient regulation, establishing criteria that should guide public policies and regulatory frameworks, not to put more obstacles to the economic activity in place, intervening the less possible with proportionality and under the necessity principle. A second decalogue was to improve the effectiveness of public aid. Remember the time, it's 2021, with all the resilience funds, with all the money being bumped into the economy. Do it, but do it right. Do it according to competition principles. And then the decalogue was, again, a checklist of things that you should not do when granting or designing state aid funds. And the third one was a decalogue for efficient public procurement. It's always a priority for the CNMC because between 10 and 15% of our GDP is directly related to public procurement, and then it's not only that, it's also that it is a key channel for restructuring public-private cooperation and collaboration with industrial and innovation policies. So it's directly going into the subject matter of our discussion. And there, of course, we were trying to guide the authorities in the design of this. That's an example, but I can give you others. For example, we are doing more and more impact assessment on how intervention into the economy, in particular subsidies, is impacting the economy as a whole. In 2022, we did a quantitative analysis of public aid for broadband development in Spain, or in 2023, an impact assessment on the MOVES 3 plan, which aimed to promote and adopt electric vehicles and deployment of the charging infrastructure. Or, for example, we've just recently, so as recently as yesterday, approved a market study with an impact assessment on the self-consumption on photovoltaic plants. So this is trying to show how the intervention into the economy can be done under competitive or pro-competitive principles. There are many others, but I am not going to extend it because all of them are published in our website. Every single document that we adopt is public. So you can go there and see how we have selected those sectors in the economy that we believe have this facilitating or multiplying factor and aligning to what we believe are the most sensitive things now. By the way, we've just launched a public consultation on how to improve the housing. That is a huge problem now everywhere, but in particular in Spain. And we start by the pillars. So how to improve the offer in land for building up, because we believe that there are lots of obstacles there, and we've just launched it in order to, so if you want to have a say, it's open. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenny. We are trying to do the same in Portugal because we have the housing problem here the same way as you do in Spain, so we also, at the authority, think we have a role to play there. So we share the same concerns and we have the same tools, so we are completely aligned. Now, moving to you, Benoit, you mentioned some of the proposals that came out from the Draghi report. I said that the EU sometimes is good in planning, but not in executing. So how can we execute, how can we implement the Draghi proposals, and how can competition policy be used in order to implement the EU priorities? You mentioned also the discussion that is ongoing about the EU merger guidelines nowadays. So what's your view on this?
So, I mean, first, let me once again say, and I think our discussion today is really testifies to it, that competition authorities should be part of that discussion. They have a duty to be part of that discussion. As we always say, I mean, if you don't sit at the table, then you're on the menu, right? So if we're not part of the discussion, we are not going to like the result. And we also have, so that's the easy part. And then the more difficult part is that we have to accept that it's a two-way street. and that the discussion is not only about how to make industrial policy pro-competitive, and it's also about how to enforce competition law with an unchanged legal. I'm not talking about changing the legal framework, but just enforcement of the existing EU framework in a way that's consistent with the overall goals of the Union and of our member states. And there is a lot we can do without changing the law here. And the second part is more difficult for us as competition authorities, and it's not universally accepted in the competition community. So there is also a question of mindset and culture here. But now going into the specifics, what we've been doing at the Autorité is very, I think, consistent with what Kenny has described. That is using our advocacy powers full scale to try to have a say on ongoing discussions, and if possible, even on future discussions on industrial policy at a sectoral level, at industry level. If you take the two main goals of industrial policy, I guess in most member states and also in Europe, which are digitalization and the energy transition. So that's, these are the two pillars of what we're doing, broadly speaking. The method we've used is trying to identify emerging markets, which are where we do have strong government interventions through subsidies or public companies intervening and so on. When it's still time to have a say on the competitive structure of these markets and to issue recommendations which have to be as practical, as detailed as possible. So we've done that in the energy and climate field. We had a market study on land transportation back 2 years ago, focusing very much on the decarbonation side of the discussion and how do we incentivize transports and interconnection or intermodularity between transports that is conducive to using decarbonized transports. And how can we, and we had very practical recommendations on how to organize tenders at a local level for local transports that could be conducive to that. We had an opinion on charging docks for electric cars, also raising the same kind of discussions. It's interesting to note that these market studies were not asked to us by the government. We decided to do it because we felt it would be important and that we wanted to have a say in that discussion. And maybe one even more interesting example is on the electricity market, a market that Kenny knows very well. Mm-hmm. When the government, the French government decided to change the way nuclear energy is being distributed, which was for the last 10 years based on a big state aid called AREN in French. So it's basically the state company EDF was mandated to sell cheap nuclear electricity to retailers. And the government and EDF decided to go for a more market-based system, which, of course, at a very general level we like, with contracts being negotiated between EDF and the main players, different types of contracts. And we expected the French government to ask our opinion. They never asked for our opinion, so maybe they knew that they wouldn't like our opinion, I don't know, but they didn't ask for it. So we took a kind of unusual route, and I picked my phone and I called my colleague from the energy regulator, Emmanuel Vargon, and we wrote a letter together to the French government with a number of warning signals or kind of warning points. And the overall message was, okay, you're taking away a big state aid, which we like, but be sure that just make sure that you're not going to move from state aid to abuse of dominance, just to put it in kind of broad terms, right? And so you need safeguards, you need guardrails on this market if you want to avoid that this, of course, dominant player, EDF, treats its competitors and distributors in a fair way. And we highlighted a number of very, very specific points here. So we took that initiative because nobody had asked for our opinion, so we decided that it was our duty to go public and say it. So that's just an example. And in the digital field, we also had a series of market studies on cloud services, on AI, just like you did here also in Portugal. You mentioned it, Nuno. We are taking it forward. There will be a study on AI and energy, and whether access to energy is a barrier to entry in AI. That will come out in January, I think, well, very soon, within a few weeks, and so on. So the lessons, I think the lessons are first, don't be shy, and if they don't ask your opinion, you might have to give it nevertheless, even if some will not like it, but that's just your job as an independent enforcer and authority. Second, team up with industry regulators when needed. So that's, of course, easier for Kani because she's also an industry regulator, which I'm not. But we've done that with the energy regulator. We've done that with the data protection authority. And so we really want to have that kind of partnerships with industry regulators, each coming with its own angle into the discussion. Be as forward-looking as possible, so scan the horizon. And in a number of cases, it's too late. And so you might want to have the high moral ground and saying that some of market X or Y is anti-competitive, but it's just too late. So if you want to have an impact, you've got to do it as early as possible and to scan the horizon and identify new markets, even if you take the risk, of course, of being wrong, because the markets will not look like what you had expected. But that's a risk you should be able to take. And now, if you ask me what's my main regret, because it all looks like we've been very good, and I don't want to look at the discussion only through rosy glasses. I think where we've not been very good is on having an impact on the discussion on the governance of industrial policies, which I mentioned earlier. And nobody asked us, and maybe we should have been more proactive, and maybe we should have passed a view on the consequences of a number of national industrial policies for competition. And we've not done that. So that might be maybe a hint at what we should be doing in the future.
Thank you, Benoit. Very interesting. Now moving to you, Antonio. I mentioned previously that you're advising the Portuguese government, or actually several Portuguese governments since a couple of years ago. And so you have dived into the industrial policy here in Portugal. So I'd like to know what's your view on the current industrial policy. Does it help to improve the Portuguese competitiveness? Can we expect a new industrial policy in Portugal in order to steer the economy in a more appropriate way? In Portugal, it became famous in the 90s, the Porter report, which supported the idea of the industrial clusters in Portugal. So can we expect now an Andreoni report following your work that you've been doing to the Portuguese government?
Thanks, Bruno. First of all, the project is a project with Professor Arjun Chang and the team, also colleagues here in Portugal. It's a team effort to, as you said, yes, probably try to reset the conversation since the initial conversation that started after the Porter report and the kind of interventions that followed after that. So when we started this project, in a way, Portugal, as many other European countries, was actually in a strange situation 1.5 years ago. There was actually an enormous influx of funding coming through the Next Generation. Europe is still coming. Of course, the program is still, it's going to go towards the close, but still these resources were in. So the first issue was not lack of resources, was do we have strategic ideas around how a long-term plan that allow us to use resources in an effective way. And going back to the point about governance and capacity to use instruments, do we have this capacity? So I think to the credit of the Portuguese institution, there was the realization that was important for Portugal to do not simply, if you want, continue with the status quo, right? Ultimately, many countries in the relationship with industrial policy made a choice. The choice was, we don't do industrial policy, but that is a choice in itself, determine specific type of outcome, right? So the first issue was trying to restart taking responsibility of this key economic policy instrument. And one of the things that came out very clearly from the analysis, and we worked lots with also a large steering committee involving businesses, different governments, departments, ministries, and so on, is that Portugal doesn't lack instruments. In fact, Portugal has one of the most generous R&D tax credit instruments in Europe, the VII program. Portugal has institutions who have delivered grant subsidies, financial type of instruments, as you mentioned, has had an industrial cluster policy and so on. So the real issue that emerged was not lack of instruments, but how these instruments are understood as part of a strategy that delivers towards specific type of trajectory of the economy. And in a way, this point around making choices, it's not simply about where we want to see Portugal in 10, 15, 20 years, because this is the time of the long cycle of investment that are required to transform the economy, but also at the level of the instruments that were used, choices were not made. And this is important from the competitive angle point of view as well, right? So you can design R&D tax credit, you can create competition for financial grants, whatever. But if you are not able to introduce mechanisms where you do not necessarily choose companies, but you choose the kind of profile of players that are going to be able to deliver on the outcome that you're trying to achieve, companies that have a track record of investment or companies that have potential to be innovative and so on. So if this kind of, if you want, ex ante identification criteria are not in place, already you struggle to have outcome in terms of who is going to receive the funding that then is going to deliver on the outcome. If there are no conditionalities, or if you want, elements that introduce commitment mechanisms so that the companies that receive funding are parting of this kind of broader industrial strategy, again, the risk is that fundamentally the delivery on these instruments is limited. So this was a first problem. And we try to look at the instruments against the competitiveness gaps analysis that we have been conducting. And here I think the issue is very clear. I mean, there are a number of problems that are also related to industry structures. We have a country where the distribution of firms is extremely skewed, one of the most skewed distribution across Europe, meaning few companies. There are some companies by themselves contribute 1% or 1.5% of the export or GDP of the country, right? So that's the level of, and these players are international players who have found in Portugal, particularly in the north, where there is a rich industrial ecosystem and tradition, important specialist contractors that are able to deliver on innovative solutions, that are able to customize and deliver in a way similar to, as an Italian, of the third Italy traditional type of model. Now, this kind of cluster are not sufficient to drive competitiveness at the systemic level. So there is a problem around rebuilding ecosystems that are able, in a competitive way along the value chain, to create value and retain value in Portugal. And to do that, there is the need to potentially use also competition instruments that allow to reach sufficient level of scale that allow the company to be able to invest. So building up managerial capabilities, building up export capacity, and so on and so forth. So these things don't happen by themselves, require industrial competition policy to be put in place. I mean, the government, and this is the governments, because of course Portugal is going through quite a period, has started using some instruments which are, if you want, interesting from the point of view of addressing these industrial ecosystem gaps, which are so-called mobilizing agendas, which are sort of instruments that bring together consortia of firms that are trying in a cooperative and competitive way, so in a sort of co-opetition situation, to develop, put together their muscles, their capabilities to develop specific product services, leapfrogging in specific technologies, areas, and so on. So there are interesting elements there that I think we should look at, and there are academics here in Portugal who are studying and monitoring how this is developing. The key issue that these instruments are also showing is that it's important to think about how the instruments work as a package of instruments in the country. There has been lots of emphasis in the past around making sure that the individual industrial policy have additionality. And that, again, it's part of delivering competitive outcome, making sure that the government effort and the state support is actually delivering for the broader society, the market, the consumers, and so on. But we are seeing more and more that the only way to understand really impact is to look at how different instruments combined deliver or not what we call super additionality, meaning deliver an outcome that is more than the sum of the part of the instruments that are used. And that super additionality normally is the result of very careful coordination, sequencing, and alignment of instruments. And within those instruments are not just financial or fiscal, are not just giving money. It's about regulatory measures. It's about structuring processes in a way that deliver the kind of outcome. The last point I would like to make is that we have seen how when Europe is becoming more generous, if you want, even in terms of relaxing some state aid elements or trying to, the problem is that countries who for many years have not done industrial policy struggle to make good use of this space. And in a way, it's reinforcing divergence more than increasing opportunity. Because of course, if you think about how France and Germany, the two main countries who use some of this more open space for state support, these are countries also who have more fiscal capacity, who are more able to actually have also larger players, larger corporations that operate across Europe. So we have to be aware that countries who have not used industrial policy, even when more resources are available, if they are not able to catch up in building governance structure and capabilities to use these resources, might actually lag behind, right? So the effect can be the opposite of what we want to achieve. And here I think one of the critical issues here is, if we think about things you kind of was mentioning, procurement and things like that, we know that in many of the new technology areas, especially on the green and so on, offtake agreements, being able to create demand, being able to structure demand, it's essential. It's not just a supply side problem. And in many of these areas, government has a very important role to play with procurement and functional procurement and all the provision that the procurement law allows. To use this instrument, you need to have governments who are able to do that. And often also mechanisms that allow government to be entrepreneurial in doing that. Because many people in government would be scared to use some of these instruments simply because they are more difficult to manage. It's more difficult to be sure that you are compliant vis-a-vis certain type of regulation. So we need to think about, for example, how competition authorities can help in being more entrepreneurial in using the policy space that exists within the regulation space that we operate in. And I think this is a problem that it's not just a Portugal problem. It's in many countries, I'm Italian, in many countries, more resources have not resulted necessarily in more industrial policy or better industrial policy. So we need to be very careful in understanding that if we want to have better industrial policy in the future, the state has to be rebuilding its capacity to foresight, in its capacity to have strategy, in its capacity to make choices. And we need to also be aware that industrial policy is about failure as well, and accept building a culture where if failure is accountable, is transparent, effort has been made, experimentation has been done, that is part of what the state is supposed to do. And that, of course, changed the way in which also we talk about industrial policy across institutions that might become more allergic to any type of state failure, and in the relationship between the government and the public opinion that has to support this kind of learning process through which innovation growth will fundamentally happen. By fixing everything, being scared that all these things potentially will derail, we will just get a rigor mortis of no economic growth, no innovation, no dynamism in the society, with all the problems that I think letter report, drug report have emphasized.
Thank you, Tony. So that gives a role also to the Portuguese Competition Authority to contribute to industrial policy in Portugal. I think I'm feeling pressured by you, but at the same time I'm optimistic about the future, knowing that you're also helping to shape the Portuguese industrial policy in the near future with that Chang and Andreoni report that hopefully will come out in the future. Now moving to Benoit and also to the rest of the panelists, you all have your experience in international forum. You're at the same time you're chair of the competition committee at the OECD. Kenny has also an important role when it comes to the ASEAN and Latin American Forum, and Antonio also part of international forum in terms of the competition policy and competition law. So I don't know, from your international experience, what's the role that they can have in order to promote this debate and to contribute to industrial policy. And starting by you, Benoit, at the OECD level, what do you think about it?
Yeah, thank you, Nuno, and of course that includes you as Vice Chair of the ICN, playing a very important role here. Two things. First, I think international cooperation starts at the EU level. Of course, it goes without saying for us competition authorities because it's in our DNA and it's in EU law, and we enforce EU law. As Lindsay reminded us earlier, 85% of all decisions based on Articles 101 and 102 have been taken by national authorities. So we are European. We are part of the European system, and that discussion should start at a European level. So it's obvious. Within the European competition network, of course, and we do discuss industrial policy and competition also in the ECN. But let me say that it's also a discussion that we should use our inner knowledge of the EU system also to educate national policymakers and some national authorities to the importance of taking an EU view, which is what Kenny just did when it comes about interconnection and taking the European view to some markets, and I think we should be part of that, and also talk with other EU institutions. When we celebrated our 15th anniversary last year at the Autorité de la Concurrence, I invited Christine Lagarde to give a speech, and she gave a wonderful speech about why competition matters for monetary policy and why the ECB needs strong competition enforcement. The speech it's on our website. It's also on the ECB website. And there are different reasons. One very simple reason being that, if you want monetary policy, if you want changes in leading interest rates to be transmitted to the economy, you want prices to be close to marginal costs, right? Which is what competition is about. And so she gave a kind of a passionate, speech about, why strong competition enforcement is important also for the macro management of the Eurozone in that case, but also of the EU more generally. I think we should be more mindful of that kind of interconnections, at a European level between different institutions and domains and policy domains. Second, of course, at the international level, I would like to say a word about the OECD, because not only the OECD Competition Committee, the closest we have from having a binding international framework for competition enforcement. It's not very binding, to be honest, but we have OECD recommendations that set a direction which is common and agreed by all OECD members, and there is a commitment to abide by the OECD recommendations. And also, and I would like to insist on that, the OECD is an institution, it's an intergovernmental institution which has a grasp on many of the issues we've been discussing today. Innovation, regulation, energy, education, digital. The OECD has the right experts on all these all these matters, and so what we've been doing, and here I pay tribute to Frédéric Génie, who's here and who led the committee into this interdisciplinary and cross-fertilized approach. We can tap on OECD resources to discuss the interaction between competition policy and industrial policy, and Frédéric has done that. We can tap OECD resources when we discuss the competitive structure of cloud services, and we've done that recently with participants from the Science and Technology Department of the OECD, and so on and so forth. We will have a discussion soon on AI infrastructures. We will have a discussion soon on in working party number 2, which is part of the competition committee and led by Nathalie Harsdorf, who's who's our Austrian colleague, and she will lead a discussion on anti-competitive regulation, starting with a focus on health services, but which may be extended later to other sectors and industries. So the OECD is really the right place to kind of tap the right resources and put together different angles and different expertise to make sense of these discussions. So and we are very, I as chair, but also the whole bureau and the members of the committee, we are very committed to use that strength to contribute to the discussions we're having today, and to also to identify new topics, which will help us, as I said again earlier, be more specific and put flesh on the discussions we're having today, coming with practical recommendations on how to better combine industrial policy and competition. Yes. So watch this space. There will be more to come. It's all public, so all the background notes by OECD Secretariat and contributions by delegates are all public and posted on the website, and it's an incredible wealth of knowledge and expertise.
Yeah, yes, I advise everyone to look at the background notes from the OECD. Really, they are great, and they are a way to learn and to understand what's happening. And the OECD has a very important role for this debate, and you as chair of the competition committee, of course. You also called my role as vice chair of the ICN, and I will try to promote this cross-policy debate, and this panel is an example of that. So now moving to you, Kani, what's your thoughts on this? What's your take for this topic?
Well, of course, we are very much into the European cooperation through the ECM, but that's something that we all already know. We also have a special interest in reinforcing international cooperation with our neighbors, north of Africa, Morocco, and of course, also because as energy regulators as well, we have lots of things going on among us. But I would say that both Portugal and Spain, we have a special responsibility with the Latin American region. And I would like to underline the very nice cooperation that we have through the OECD Forum Latin American and Caribbean of Competition, where we organize, Portugal and Spain, we organize the Iberian competition forum every single year there. And I have to say that in particular this year, for example, in Asunción, in Paraguay, I was very pleased to see how there was this sense of comradeship, in fact. There is a way in which competition authorities tend to exchange views in a relaxed way, and this provides, I think, for a much more important backup than what you can have in the international meetings. ICN is really very good, but I would say that in this particular forum, we are able to discuss openly the difficulties that we are facing and how to support each other. And this is proving extremely productive, I would say, for the development of the region, because the more rigorous, authentic, and independent that the authorities in the region are, the better for their economies. That's a very clear example. And we try to export there the best ideas that we have and exchange views with them and learn from them as well, because they struggle with things that we have to pay attention to as well. And one of the themes that, for example, this year we were discussing among them was the interaction between advocacy and enforcement or public procurement, which are areas in which clearly industrial policy is embedded. And I still remember, for example, and to illustrate one of the examples that you were mentioning, in public procurement, for example, we realized that our industrial ecosystem, both in Portugal and Spain, but also in many of those countries, is mainly SME composed. In Spain, for example, is 98% of our industrial ecosystem is SMEs, small and medium-sized companies. And we detected that first through enforcement, but then we wanted to understand it well through advocacy. Why is it that SMEs are not concurring to public procurement? In most of the cases, we just have one big company. So this is also the case, for example, in the region. And now we are carrying out a study to understand which are the obstacles for SMEs to concur to public procurement in order to be able to make recommendations to the public powers and the legislators. This is something that is is very well illustrated with several problems in the regions that are similar to us. So in a way, this cooperation allows us to provide for a forum of exchange of ideas, and maybe we are better able to find solutions together. So I think that's a must that we have to do.
And Benoit, you want to add something? Then
if I may just come back and add a footnote. I think what's really good in the ICN and also at UNCTAD in Geneva, dear Teresa, is also at the OECD, but probably less so, is that we can learn from the experiences of emerging market economies and developing economies in areas such as the ones we are discussing today. And these experiences can be very relevant for us.
Food chain, for example.
Food chain has been an important discussion both in Geneva and also in the ICN. Payments is an area where we have a lot to learn from developing and emerging market economies. I mean, when I was a payment regulator, I used to joke in conferences that a realistic objective for Europe and the G7 would be to catch up on Kenya, right, in payments. So we have a lot to learn, and these places are exactly the places where we can learn also on industrial policies which have been successful or failures, because we have to learn from both in emerging and developing economies.
Yes, thank you, Benoit. It's very important to mention the Latin American Forum, where we were just a few days ago, and I take this opportunity also to salute the Portuguese-speaking countries that are here. We have strong ties at the Portuguese Competition Authority with several African countries. I know Mozambique, Angola, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, they are here, also East Timor and Brazil, of course, and it's very important to have this bilateral relation where we can learn from each other. I'm mentioning the African countries, and I do know, Antonio, having experience in African countries, so tell us about it.
I'm happy to follow on both Karim Benoit on this issue. I mean, I've been having the honor to serve in the Presidential Economic Advisory Council of President Ramaphosa in South Africa, and of course South Africa now is leading the G20, the end of the G20 process. And what is interesting is that, you know, if you think about many of these countries, you just mentioned what they call the Safaricom nation, Kenya, right? Or you think about the experience of many of these countries in the digital space upstream industry, I was mentioning steel, chemicals, and so on. First of all, many of these countries have the same actors that we deal with in Europe, right? ArcelorMittal is the major player in South Africa as much as of course, in Italy, and not only in Italy. But also in these countries, to a certain extent, because industrial policy, and I think we need to go back to the core, it's basically choices, a political economy issue. It's not it requires technical knowledge, but it's not a technical pure exercise, right? It's about also, shaping the economy, shaping the social contract in a certain way. Because of that, it's been very difficult to see implementation of industrial policy across the African continent. There has been lots of problems, not just in terms of state capture, which is part of the natural dynamic of early stages of transformation and so on, so nothing particularly peculiar there, but the implementation of industrial policy, the enforcement of them has been very difficult. On the other hand, when we look at the experience of some competition authorities, and here I'm very lucky to be involved with some people I know here as well, Professor Simon Roberts and others who have been leading work across, in particular, sub-Saharan African countries. We were just 2 weeks back in Namibia discussing competition authorities across the region. And what is very clear is that these authorities, with all the need to catch up with a number of others, they're also very innovative. If you think about public interest provisions in the South African Competition Commission and how they use that to engage with economic policy issues, it's actually quite interesting for how we have to rethink, the discussion around dynamic rivalry, dynamic efficiency, and so on. In many of these countries, they're also clear that while they're discussing about the free trade continental agreement, and to a certain extent, of course, Europe has been a reference point as it was for the East African community 15, 20 years ago. The reality is that firms have done their integration already. There are firms across the African continent that operate in ways that constrain competition, use their power in many different ways, and these companies are already, building up this free trade continental area, but the institutions that are supposed to regulate that are supposed to monitor what they're doing, they're supposed to sanction behaviors, abusive behaviors, and so on, are struggling to do so exactly because the need of this coordination, the need to have sharing data, sharing information, sharing everything that has to do also with very simple processes in terms of how to coordinate who act first, who conduct certain type of investigation, market inquiries, and so on. So I think it's a very promising area where competition authority in the continent, in the African continent, have an experience and some instrument, concrete teeth, to be able to go to places and start market inquiries in sectors that are critical for development and where innovation is happening. I mean, there has been market inquiry in the health sector and the insurance sector in South Africa, which probably are ahead of the curve of some of the investigations that they've done here in Europe, and again with companies that are also trying to penetrate the European market, in the one specific that has been successful in the UK case. So I think this is a very exciting area, but I guess as probably we all share, an area where we need to move ahead and remove lots of taboos around this conversation, which I think have been very counterproductive up to far.
I think it's interesting because I do think that in African countries, international cooperation is needed in order to leverage the power of the authorities. The more regional cooperation they have, the more power the authorities have to tackle all the competition issues that arise. So we are heading to the final stage of this panel, which was, I think it was amazing, it was brilliant. Let me just, one final question. There's a famous song by Bob Dylan that says, the times they are changing. So I wanted to ask you, if you want to mention some soundtrack for nowadays, for the current times, what would it be? You know, following this famous song of Bob Dylan, if you, for now, you can choose any song you'd like, just to make a wrap-up, and so that we can after go to a nice lunch here. I don't know, you want to, Benoit, who wants to start? Or any song?
Yeah, I guess I will, still thinking about it, but I think I would choose this song by Elvis, you know. A little less conversation, a little more action.
I don't know who wants to step in now. Antonio?
I have no idea what to pick. In a way, that's why I think Kani was checking REM, Radiohead songs before we were starting. So probably we were trying to find something that, I think it's some heavy metal stuff, because so much confusion at the moment. It's very difficult to focus, right? To be able to, and this really limits the capacity of the government. There is so much pressure and distraction from the work that government authorities have to make. So you can pick any type of very heavy metal stuff. That
I don't know if
out.
Max Kadar is in the room. You know, Max Kadar really likes heavy metal, and he gets relaxed when he listens to heavy metal. Maybe that's why he works at Digicom. I don't know. Now, Highway to Hell, right?
Highway to Hell.
Kenny.
Well, you're right, I am much more an REM fan, and I was trying to locate the song that I like so much, and the song is, "It is the end of the world as I know it," and I am fine. So I think that would be for me, yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. I think it was brilliant, it was very interesting. We'll take very good notes of everything that was said here, and please join me in a round of applause to our panelists.
Thank you.